The hearing room buzzed with the low rumble of whispered conversations, papers shuffling, and cameras adjusting their focus. It was one of those sessions that seemed quiet only on the surface underneath. Tension ran like a taut wire. Representative Jasmine Crockett sat poised, her posture straight, her expression controlled but alert. Across the dais, Representative Byron Donalds leaned back slightly in his chair, as if preparing himself for the inevitable collision. Both lawmakers had clashed indirectly in the past, but today's agenda, and the stakes guaranteed a direct confrontation. The committee chair gave the floor to Crockett first. Crockett didn't waste time. She flipped open a binder marked with color-coded tabs, the kind of organized detail she was known for. "We are here," she began, her voice steady, "because the American people deserve clarity. They deserve honesty, and they deserve accountability from those who hold public office." Her eyes briefly locked on Donald's before she looked back down at the page. Some of the statements made in recent interviews and public appearances raise questions that must be addressed. Donalds folded his hands, the faintest hint of a smirk appearing before he quickly masked it with neutrality. Crockett continued, "Congressman, you've made repeated claims regarding this committee's work. Claims that undermine not just members of the opposing party, but the integrity of the institution itself." She pushed her binder forward. "So let's start with your assertion that the investigations undertaken here are politically motivated and lack factual basis. Would you care to elaborate on what specific facts you believe are missing?" The room went still. Reporters leaned closer. Donalds cleared his throat, leaning forward. "Congresswoman Crockett, my comments were about an overall pattern," he replied. "What I said, and what I stand by, is that this committee keeps pursuing narratives without producing actual evidence that supports the severity of the claims. I call it political because, frankly, that's what it looks like to the average American. Endless hearings, endless speculation, but not enough substance." Crockett nodded slowly. "So essentially it looks political to you. That's the basis." Donalds raised a finger. "No. It's based on the obvious imbalance. What gets scrutinized heavily and what gets conveniently ignored." Crockett shifted slightly, sensing the opening he was giving her. "Conveniently ignored. Congressman, would you specify what you believe has been ignored? Because I can produce documentation showing the breadth of what this committee has reviewed." He exhaled sharply. "Let's be honest here. Certain topics get amplified because they're helpful to your side politically. Other topics that might cast your leadership or your allies in a bad light, somehow never make it to the level of urgency this committee applies elsewhere." Crockett's expression sharpened. "If that's the claim, then let's get specific. Give me an example of something you believe was neglected." Donalds paused, knowing specificity carried risk. Cameras zoomed in. Staffers held their breath. "Well," he began, "take the oversight related to administrative decisions. Problems that have come from mismanagement across several agencies. Instead of diving into those, we wind up chasing narratives that poll well for your base." Crockett tapped a pen gently on her folder. "So again, you're suggesting a perception problem rather than a factual one." Donald shook his head. "No, I'm suggesting a priority problem. The exchange was civil so far, but beneath the civility stood unmistakable friction." Crockett flipped through her binder again and pulled out a sheet. "Congressman, I want to read back one of your statements," she said, adjusting her glasses. "This committee has lost credibility because it refuses to address corruption unless it benefits one political narrative. That is your quote, correct?" Donalds didn't look away. "Yes, good," Crockett replied. "Because I want you to explain how you reconcile that statement with the fact that over the last 18 months, this committee has subpoenaed individuals and documents from both parties, opened inquiries into bipartisan issues, and published findings that include criticisms of members of our own side. That doesn't exactly fit the narrative you're pushing." Donalds leaned back again. "What you call balanced, I call cosmetic. Throw in a few token actions for plausible deniability, then focus the bulk of the work somewhere else." A few people in the audience gasped at the bluntness. Crockett didn't react outwardly, but internally, she recognized Donalds had crossed into the territory where she excelled precision dismantling. "Congressman," she said, her voice tightening just enough to signal the shift. "You keep using broad language. Looks political, cosmetic, narrative. But what I'm asking for is proof. You're a member of Congress. You should understand the difference between political commentary and evidence. So let's do this. Present one specific instance, one, where this committee knowingly dismissed credible evidence for political gain." Donalds hesitated. He looked off to the side, then back at her. "I don't think you understand. It's not about a single instance. It's about cumulative behavior." Crockett smiled faintly, the smile of someone who'd anticipated that answer. "That's convenient," she said. "Because cumulative behavior still requires examples." Donalds bristled. "What I'm saying is obvious to the public. They can see what's happening." Crockett shot back. "The public sees what they're told to see unless we, leaders with platforms, commit to the truth. And when statements are made without evidence, they don't inform, they mislead. Sometimes intentionally." That last line struck harder than she let on. Donalds shifted forward, his tone deepening. "Careful, Congresswoman," he said. "Are you suggesting my statements were intentionally misleading?" Crockett didn't blink. "I'm suggesting that when an elected official repeatedly claims corruption without producing examples, the effect is the same intentionally or not." That landed. Donalds bristled again, preparing his rebuttal. "The issue with your argument," he replied, "is that you assume this committee is operating impartially. It's not, and I have every right to call that out even if you don't like it." Crockett shot back, her words measured but sharp. "Calling something out is only legitimate if it's true, Congressman, not if it's politically convenient, not if it's designed to sow doubt, and not if it undermines the work of everyone sitting at this table." Her statement drew murmurs through the hearing room. Donalds clenched his jaw, but continued. "Look, you and I both know how Washington works. Committees take direction from leadership. Leadership has priorities. Those priorities aren't neutral, and you have yet." Crockett interjected, "to provide a single example that supports your accusation." Donalds leaned in. "Maybe the examples aren't as tidy as you'd like. Maybe the system is complicated. Maybe the bias isn't one smoking gun, but a dozen small decisions that all lean one way." Crockett countered quickly. "Then say that. Say it's your perception, but you didn't. You claimed fact. You told the public this committee has lost credibility. Statements like that damage public trust." Donalds exhaled through his nose. "Public trust was damaged long before I said anything. But you added to it?" Crockett responded, voice steady but firm. "And you did so without evidence." The chair's gavel struck sharply. "Members will maintain decorum," he said, though the tone suggested he knew the confrontation was far from over. As the gavel's echo faded, Crockett and Donalds continued staring at each other across the table, neither backing down, neither willing to concede even a rhetorical inch. The first clash had ended, but only formally. In substance, the battle lines had just been drawn. The committee reconvened after a brief recess, the tension in the room palpable. Reporters whispered in low tones, adjusting cameras as staff shuffled documents nervously. Crockett sat upright, exuding a calm that belied the fire in her eyes. Donalds, meanwhile, leaned slightly forward, hands clasped together, the faint crease between his eyebrows signaling that he was preparing for a sharper exchange. Crockett picked up her notes, flipping to a highlighted section. Congressman Donalds, before we proceed, I want to address another point in your public remarks. She began, her voice steady but incisive. You stated that members of this committee, myself included, selectively pursue narratives that suit political agendas. You've framed this as a systemic issue, yet you haven't provided a single example where a legitimate investigation was skipped or manipulated for political gain. How do you justify that statement? Donalds inhaled slowly, meeting her gaze. Congresswoman, the American people don't need me to spell out every detail. They see patterns, endless hearings focusing on one side, while similar actions by the other side receive little scrutiny. It's obvious. His tone was firm, almost dismissive. Perception is reality in politics. Crockett leaned forward, the binder now resting on the table like a shield and a weapon at once. Perception is not the same as evidence, she said sharply. You are implying misconduct. You are implying corruption. That is a serious allegation, Congressman, and the burden of proof is yours. Without it, your statements are not constructive. They are misleading. Donalds raised a hand, a subtle gesture meant to punctuate his next point. I'm not saying anything is fabricated. I'm saying the focus is uneven. The public can judge for themselves. Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly, a practiced mix of patience and authority in her expression. Let's not talk hypotheticals. Let's focus on specifics. For example, your claim about uneven focus, you have made it repeatedly. Yet, in the last 12 months, this committee has initiated inquiries into over 30 separate matters, half of which involve members and actions across the political spectrum. Ignoring that record isn't perception, it's denial of facts. Donalds didn't flinch. You can list numbers all you want, Congresswoman. The impact matters more than the tally. When hearings are selective in terms of media coverage and political weight, the impression left on citizens is skewed. That's reality. The tension in the room thickened. Crockett's voice rose slightly, but her tone remained controlled. The problem, Congressman, is that repeated mischaracterizations erode public trust. You are in a position of influence. Your statements matter, and when you assert systemic bias without evidence, you are weaponizing your platform. Do you see the difference? Donalds leaned back, crossing his arms. You can frame it that way, sure, but leadership bias, committee direction, and partisan priorities, these are real. Pretending they don't exist is naive. I call it out. That's my job as a representative. Crockett's response was precise and measured, the kind of verbal maneuvering honed over years in law and politics. Calling something out requires facts. Criticism without verification isn't leadership, it's commentary, and your comments, repeated in media outlets and press releases, cross that line. You have a responsibility to the public to substantiate your claims. Donalds's jaw tightened. And I have the responsibility to speak truth as I see it. I can't be silenced just because it challenges narratives you defend. Crockett leaned forward, her tone cutting but professional. Truth, Congressman, is rooted in evidence. Statements like this committee is lost are not neutral. They carry weight. They are interpreted as fact even when they are opinion. This is why specificity matters. Donalds's eyes flicked briefly to his notes, then back to Crockett. You are asking for proof in areas that are inherently subjective. How do you quantify perception? Crockett exhaled slowly, clearly anticipating the tactic. Congressman, the law doesn't leave room for subjectivity in allegations of wrongdoing. Evidence is the standard. Facts, documents, and verifiable testimony. These are the tools we use, not broad statements meant to undermine public confidence. The room remained silent as her words landed. Reporters scribbled furiously. Staffers exchanged glances, understanding that this exchange was becoming one of those moments that could define public perception of both politicians. Donalds leaned in slightly, voice lowering but sharpened. And yet, Congresswoman, you focus on minutiae. You dissect wording and demand evidence in a process that often takes months, even years, to reveal the whole picture. Meanwhile, public confidence erodes daily. If we wait for perfect proof, citizens assume bias is unchallenged. Crockett's response was almost surgical. And if we accept every unverified claim as truth, we weaponize perception and erode institutional integrity. There is a balance, Congressman. One cannot simply assert wrongdoing as a political strategy. It's irresponsible. Donalds's hands unclenched, then rested on the table. You call it irresponsibility. I call it transparency. I highlight inconsistencies where others would prefer silence. Crockett's eyes narrowed, and she delivered the line that would echo in the media after the session. Transparency without truth is propaganda. Donalds's lips pressed into a thin line. He had been preparing for verbal confrontation, but Crockett's precise framing caught him momentarily off guard. The reporters scribbled again, the cameras captured every micro-expression. For a fleeting moment the chamber held its collective breath. After a pause, Donalds spoke, his tone measured but firm. You say I'm misleading. I disagree. I illuminate. You and your colleagues manage the optics, but the public still sees the gap. They sense the imbalance. They know when hearings target one set of actions and leave other equal or greater issues unexamined. Crockett didn't flinch. And that sense, Congressman, can be manipulated by rhetoric. That is why the committee's process and record matter more than perception. If you wish to debate fairness, then debate the documented record, not the perceived narrative. That is the difference between opinion and fact. Donalds leaned back slightly, trying to regain composure. The public is capable of understanding both. They don't need every hearing memo to see trends. Crockett shot back immediately. They need you to be responsible in your statements. Trends are only trends if verified. Otherwise, they are claims, and claims repeated in national media without substantiation are dangerous. For the first time in the exchange, a subtle crack appeared in Donalds's composure. He paused, the weight of Crockett's persistent precision evident. The audience, sensing the tension, leaned forward. Crockett, meanwhile, remained unyielding, her calm, now a tool as sharp as any gavel. She leaned back slightly, allowing the moment to settle. Congressman, the American people deserve discourse rooted in facts. They deserve accountability, not opinion masquerading as evidence. You may believe perception equals truth. I stand for facts. That is the distinction between commentary and public service. Donalds exhaled, nodding slowly, clearly preparing for his next move. But the first part of their confrontation had already solidified a pattern. Crockett relied on precise, documented evidence, unyielding logic, while Donalds leveraged perception, rhetoric, and the weight of public sentiment. The contrast was stark, and the tension between them had become the story itself. As the committee chair called for a brief procedural break, both lawmakers sat quietly, eyes locked, each preparing mentally for the next phase of their verbal duel. The first exchanges had set the stage. Now, it was clear that neither side would yield easily. The next segment promised to push boundaries even further, testing patience, precision, and political acumen in equal measure. The first formal clash had escalated into a battle of method versus perception, evidence versus rhetoric. The chamber held its breath, sensing that what came next could redefine public understanding of accountability, integrity, and political responsibility. The committee reconvened after the procedural pause, the air thick with anticipation. Journalists whispered excitedly, snapping photos, while aides and interns exchanged glances over stacks of documents. Crockett and Donalds faced each other across the table, each radiating a mixture of resolve and caution. The tension was palpable, as if the room itself recognized that the next phase would determine not just public perception, but political reputations. Crockett adjusted her binder, her fingers tapping lightly on the table in a rhythm that suggested focus, precision, and the careful control of emotions. She spoke first, her voice calm but carrying the weight of authority. Congressman Donalds, in our earlier exchanges, you referenced perception and public opinion as the basis for your claims of bias. I want to clarify one point. Perception is not evidence. Repetition does not create proof, and public opinion cannot substitute for documented facts. Do you understand the distinction? Donalds leaned forward, elbows resting on the table, a measured intensity in his eyes. I understand perfectly, but Congresswoman, the reality is that people form opinions based on what they see and hear. If a committee repeatedly focuses its attention in ways that appear selective, the public will sense it. That perception is valid, even if the committee's intentions are otherwise. Crockett's response was precise and deliberate, the kind that had been honed over years of legal and political experience. Perception without verification is dangerous. Statements that imply misconduct, favoritism, or corruption without evidence do more than mislead. They erode the very trust necessary for our institutions to function. Congressman, this is not about opinions. This is about responsibility. Donald straightened, clearly frustrated, but maintaining his composure. And I contend that responsibility includes pointing out imbalances and potential biases, even when they are inconvenient for those in leadership. My duty is to hold power to account, regardless of party affiliation. Crockett's eyes narrowed slightly, the calm precision of her demeanor cutting like a scalpel. Holding power to account requires facts, documentation, and verifiable testimony. Without these, what you are doing is rhetoric, not oversight. You can call it accountability, but repeated claims without evidence are indistinguishable from misinformation. Donalds leaned back in his chair, a subtle shift in posture, indicating a mix of defensiveness and defiance. You can characterize it however you like, but the public can see patterns that may not be obvious in committee reports, and when leadership directs attention selectively, perception matters. It influences citizens' trust, their engagement, and their understanding of government. Crockett's response was sharp and unyielding. Congressman, influence carries responsibility. The moment you amplify unverified claims, even indirectly, you are no longer merely pointing out trends. You are shaping narratives, and shaping narratives without evidence is not oversight. It's manipulation. The room grew tense, the backhand, forth intensifying. Reporters scribbled furiously, capturing every inflection, every glance. Staffers exchanged anxious looks, knowing that this verbal duel would dominate headlines. Donalds leaned forward again, his voice steady but firm. You speak of evidence, Congresswoman, yet even the most meticulous investigations take time. Patterns emerge over months and years, not days. By the time proof is concrete, public perception may already be formed. I am simply pointing out trends as they exist in real time. Crockett's eyes locked on him, unwavering. And trends without verification are dangerous. They create a climate where unsubstantiated claims are treated as truth. Congressman, this is precisely what undermines institutional integrity. If you truly care about accountability, you will base your statements on facts, not assumptions. Donalds's jaw tightened, the intensity in his posture increasing. I understand your point, Congresswoman, but I also believe the public has a right to know when trends appear biased, even if the full picture isn't yet available. Transparency isn't perfect. Proof fits an ongoing process. My obligation is to highlight potential issues before they are buried. Crockett leaned back slightly, exhaling through her nose, as if to let the weight of her argument settle in. Transparency without accuracy is reckless. Potential issues must be investigated thoroughly and substantiated before being presented as fact. Anything less is a disservice to the citizens we serve. Congressman, you have influence. That influence carries weight. Weight without evidence is dangerous. Donalds's eyes flicked to the audience briefly, then back to Crockett. He straightened his posture, attempting to assert control over the exchange. And I maintain that highlighting patterns, regardless of whether every detail is confirmed, is necessary to hold institutions accountable. Waiting for perfect evidence often results in silence where critique is warranted. Crockett's expression hardened slightly, the calm intensity of her tone now bordering on a rhetorical blade. Holding institutions accountable does not give anyone license to make unverified claims. Accountability is rooted in facts, not speculation. You may perceive patterns, Congressman, but perception is not proof, and the distinction between the two is not optional. It is fundamental to the work of governance. The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Crockett's words settling in. Donalds exhaled slowly, a subtle recognition that the exchange had reached a critical point. Yet he did not yield entirely. I respect your perspective, Congresswoman, but I also respect my duty to highlight trends and call out potential inconsistencies in real time. If that challenges leadership or established narratives, so be it. Crockett's eyes held his unwavering. Then let us agree on this, Congressman. Highlight trends responsibly, substantiate your claims with evidence, and do not allow perception alone to dictate public narratives. Our duty is to the truth, not convenience or optics. Anything less undermines the very foundation of public trust. Donalds leaned back, silently acknowledging the force of her argument. Neither spoke for several seconds. The tension between method and perception, evidence and rhetoric, settling into a quiet intensity. The committee chair, sensing the need to restore order, gently tapped the gavel. This session will adjourn shortly. Members, please submit any final statements in writing. Crockett and Donalds exchanged a final measured glance, part acknowledgement, part challenge. The confrontation was over, at least formally, but the impact of their exchange would reverberate beyond the committee room. Crockett had defended precision, accountability, and the primacy of evidence. Donalds had insisted on perception, public awareness, and the duty to highlight trends. Both had pushed the boundaries of decorum, rhetoric, and influence. As the room emptied, reporters and staff buzzed with speculation. The debate would dominate headlines, but the real story was not just the clash itself. It was the contrast in approach. Crockett's meticulous, evidence-based method had met Donalds's rhetorical, perception-driven approach head-on, creating a debate that was both intellectually rigorous and politically charged. The session concluded not with a resolution, but with a clear delineation of philosophy. Crockett's message was unambiguous. Accountability is meaningless without evidence. Donalds's stance was equally clear. Public perception, when wielded responsibly, is a tool for accountability. The collision of these perspectives left the audience and the nation considering not just the substance of the debate, but the responsibility of those in power to navigate truth, perception, and influence with care. In the end, neither had completely bested the other, but both had demonstrated their principles with unflinching clarity. And in that clash of ideology, the American public was left to judge not just the statements made, but the very meaning of accountability, transparency, and responsibility in governance.